On the third night of camp, July 28, 2016, the air over Lakevale Pines was humid and still, the way northern Pennsylvania gets in midsummer, dense with tree frogs and the distant roll of thunder that never arrives. Campers had finished their s'mores, counselors had done final rounds, and flashlights clicked off one by one as the forest settled into its usual hush. The night was supposed to be just like any other. 12-year-old Brielle Markson had arrived 4 days earlier with a purple duffel bag and a handwritten packing list taped inside the top flap. It was her first time away from home for longer than a night. She was quiet, polite, the kind of kid who listened carefully to instructions and always zipped her hoodie all the way up. She wasn't especially outdoorsy, but her mother thought it would be good for her. Something to build confidence, something to help her stop chewing her sleeves and open up a little more. She was assigned to Cabin B, middle of the girls' loop, closest to the communal bathrooms and across from the lakefront path. There were 6 other girls in the cabin. That night, after lights out, some whispered about crushes. Others compared who had snuck in candy. Brielle had fallen asleep early. No complaints, no nerves, just a normal night. At 5:42 a.m., one of the girls, Jenna, woke up needing to use the bathroom. That was when she noticed Brielle's bed was empty, her blanket still tucked under the edge, pillow undisturbed. The only thing missing was her shoes. She assumed Brielle had beat her to the restroom. She went outside, checked the path. No sign of her. When Jenna came back, Brielle's bed was still empty. By 6:15, the cabin counselor was notified. The assumption was harmless enough. Brielle had gone for an early morning walk, maybe to the lake, maybe to get some quiet. They didn't want to panic, but by 7 a.m., the lead staff had been informed. By 8:10, police had been called. When authorities arrived, they were cautious but urgent. Kids wandered off all the time, especially in outdoor settings. Maybe she got turned around. Maybe she was still asleep somewhere else. But when they entered the cabin, they found her belongings undisturbed. Her backpack lay zipped at the foot of her cot. Her flashlight was still on the windowsill. No note, no warning. Her shoes, canvas slip-ons with her name written inside the tongue, were missing. But everything else remained untouched. What was more chilling, her sleeping bag was still tightly rolled at her feet. She hadn't used it that night. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks, no drag lines in the dirt outside the cabin, just the faintest depression in the grass near the stairs, as if someone had stepped off lightly and walked away. The initial 24 hours focused on the immediate area: bushes, sheds, bunk rooms, the lake. Dive teams were called in before sunset. Helicopters with infrared swept the perimeter. Cadaver dogs were brought in from 2 counties. And yet, no scent trail, no footprints, no articles of clothing. The terrain was thick with pine and brush. But Brielle had vanished like fog. Rumors spread fast among the other campers. Some whispered about bears, others about someone sneaking in. The counselors struggled to manage the growing fear without providing false reassurances. That night, half the parents had already arrived to take their children home. Lakevale Pines was officially shut down for the season. Within 48 hours, the surrounding 14 square miles had been swept. Nothing. No shred of fabric, no food wrappers, no sign that anyone had slept rough or tried to find their way out. Officials were baffled by the lack of evidence. If Brielle had wandered into the woods alone, why hadn't the dogs picked up her trail? If she'd fallen into the lake, why hadn't anything surfaced? If someone had taken her, how had they gotten in without being seen or heard? What remained was an eerie stillness, the kind that doesn't feel like a pause, but a wall. Brielle's parents, Rick and Donna Markson, arrived that second night. Her mother stood silently in the cabin for over an hour, staring at the shoes Brielle had brought but didn't wear, staring at the name written on her flashlight. No ransom note ever came, no credible sightings, no footprints that could be confirmed, and no sounds were heard by any camper that night. No screams, no car engines, no broken twigs in the dark. By the third day, search efforts were scaled back. Authorities began shifting focus from a lost child scenario to something more troubling. Someone might have taken her, or someone might have been watching. But with no witnesses, no signs of entry, and no physical trail to follow, investigators were stuck in the same place the case began. A bunk room with 6 girls, a pair of missing shoes, and an empty bed that still looked freshly made. And in the silence that followed, the question quietly started to change. Not just where did Brielle go, but how did she leave without anyone noticing or making a sound? By the end of the first week, the normal rhythms of Lakevale Pines had dissolved into something between crisis management and quiet chaos. News of Brielle Markson's disappearance had reached local media within 24 hours, but it didn't stay local for long. National outlets picked up the story within days. A missing 12-year-old girl, last seen at a remote sleepaway camp in a dense Pennsylvania forest, with no witnesses, no signs of struggle, and no leads. That kind of story traveled fast, especially when there was nothing new to say. By the morning of July 30th, a line of SUVs and sedans curved down the camp's gravel road, headlights still on in daylight. Parents weren't waiting for updates. They were arriving to take their kids home. Some were angry, most were terrified. Camp staff tried to maintain order, but it was futile. Mothers walked straight into cabins, stepping over still-packed duffels. Fathers shouted about negligence. The kids cried, confused. A few campers kept asking when Brielle would be found. Others said they'd heard something outside their cabins too. But no one could say for sure what was memory and what was fear. The camp director, a former teacher named Linda Grosvenor, stood near the front gate giving the same answer over and over. Yes, the police were still searching. Yes, they were doing everything they could. No, there had been no sign of Brielle since that morning. Search and rescue had ramped up quickly. State police took command, establishing a mobile command center on the western edge of the grounds. Specialized K-9 units were brought in, trained specifically for missing children. Helicopters flew overhead in slow arcs, equipped with thermal imaging to pick up body heat. On the ground, volunteers and rangers combed through the forest in grid patterns, marked trees, turned over brush, checked and rechecked creeks, thickets, ravines. But the forest kept its silence. The terrain around Lakevale Pines was unforgiving. The camp sat between 2 ridgelines, with steep inclines on either side and low-lying wetlands in the middle. Old logging paths crisscrossed through the pines, most long overgrown. There were caves, sinkholes, disused wells. People had gotten lost out here before, but usually they left a trail. Brielle hadn't. On the 4th day, a volunteer with a thermal drone picked up an anomaly near the south bend of the lake. Searchers rushed to the site. What they found was a faint partial barefoot print, small, likely juvenile, impressed in the wet soil just at the waterline. But it was half gone. The edges had been washed out by rain the night before. No other prints nearby, no broken branches, no sign of entry or exit. Still, it was something. Investigators flagged the area and sent samples to the lab, but the mud had degraded any possible DNA. The print couldn't even be conclusively matched to Brielle. It was her size, yes, but that was all. The wildlife theory was considered early and ruled out fast. Black bears existed in the region but were rarely aggressive, and there had been no animal signs, no claw marks, no scent, no dragging. Predators don't leave without leaving a mess. This was clean. Too clean. There were no reports of unknown vehicles on the access road. No strangers were seen near the camp that week. Park rangers confirmed that the area had been locked to the public during camp season. Trail cameras, placed sporadically by the State Forestry Department, showed no irregularities. The footage from that week showed deer, a few foxes, nothing else. With every passing day, more questions replaced answers. How did a 12-year-old girl vanish from a full camp without anyone seeing or hearing anything? How did she leave no trace, no blood, no fabric, no disturbed foliage? Had she wandered off? Was she taken? Was someone watching? Dana Markson, Brielle's mother, stayed nearby in a motel for 6 days. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She kept a pair of Brielle's socks in her jacket pocket and refused to speak to the media. Rick, her father, tried to hold things together. He spoke once at the perimeter line, begging the public to keep looking. But the leads, what little there were, dried up quickly. The lake was dredged twice. Divers came up with little more than moss and broken branches. Every nearby cabin, shed, and pit toilet was searched. The crawl spaces under each bunkhouse were checked and double-checked. Cadaver dogs sat, sniffed, moved on. By day 10, the tone changed. Rangers were quieter. Journalists moved on to other headlines. Donna went home. Volunteers dwindled. The tents came down. The K-9s were reassigned. Brielle's face was still everywhere, on utility poles, on Facebook posts, on flyers handed out at gas stations. But the urgency drained away. Not from carelessness, but from something worse, from exhaustion. Lakevale Pines was closed indefinitely. Staff were let go. The website was taken down. The once cheerful sign at the entrance, "Welcome to a week you'll never forget," was painted over in gray. The forest remained as it had always been, dense, silent, watching. And by the time the 11th day passed, there was no one left walking its trails. No new prints, no more dogs, no reason to believe it would give anything back. Not now, not ever. Owen Race was 19 at the time, technically too old to be a camper, too young to be fully in charge. He was one of 7 junior counselors hired for the summer, most of them college freshmen or recent graduates. His job was to supervise Cabin B, the same one Brielle had been assigned to. On paper, Owen had no disciplinary issues, no red flags in his background check, and had even worked at Lakevale Pines the previous summer. Quiet, responsible, kept to himself. That's how the camp director described him in her notes to investigators. But just days into the investigation, Owen's version of events began to unravel. During his first formal interview, Owen told police he'd performed a standard head count around midnight. He said all 6 girls were accounted for, asleep in their bunks. He mentioned one had tossed and turned, another had asked to use the bathroom, but eventually fell back asleep. He was calm, clear. Said nothing had seemed out of place, but when detectives followed up with the girls from Cabin B, now all back home, still shaken but willing to help, 3 of them independently said there had never been a midnight check. No one came into the room. No flashlight swept across their sleeping bags. Nothing. When confronted with this inconsistency, Owen said maybe he'd confused the nights. Maybe it was the night before. Maybe he'd looked in, saw everyone sleeping, and assumed that counted. The explanations weren't angry, just unsure, passive, apologetic, but something about them didn't sit right. It was another counselor, one assigned to Cabin E, who told police she'd noticed Owen wasn't in his cabin between 2 and 4 a.m. When asked, she assumed he'd been in the staff lounge, but when she stopped by around 2:30 to grab a drink, the lounge was dark and empty. Cell tower pings showed Owen's phone had briefly connected to a nearby hilltop cell tower at 3:17 a.m., a spot known around camp for being the only place with reception. Camp rules were clear. No phones during shift hours, no exceptions. But it wasn't the rule-breaking that raised eyebrows. It was what he did next. According to his own timeline, Owen went out around 3 a.m. to clear his head and make a quick call. He said he didn't bring a flashlight. "I just walked up the slope, stayed for 10 minutes, then jogged back." Except no one saw him return. No one remembered the door to his cabin creaking open. He wasn't seen again until nearly 4:30 a.m., when a maintenance worker on morning rotation spotted him coming from the tree line near the back of the property. He was soaked in sweat, shirt clinging to him, breathing hard. The worker, who assumed Owen had gone for a run, asked if he was okay. Owen reportedly gave a half nod and muttered something about slipping on a rock. "Just needed to move," he said. But he wasn't limping. There were no visible scrapes, no dirt on his clothes. And despite the thick summer air, his shoes weren't muddy. Later, when police asked why he hadn't returned to his cabin or contacted anyone during that stretch of time, Owen shrugged, said he didn't realize how long he'd been out, that he often walked to clear his anxiety, that it had nothing to do with Brielle. Still, the timing gnawed at investigators. Brielle was last seen around midnight. The forest search had begun around 6 a.m. Owen's 2-hour absence, unaccounted for, unverified, and coinciding almost perfectly with the window of her disappearance, now seemed less like coincidence and more like a blind spot. When asked about his phone, Owen said he'd deleted a few texts out of embarrassment, something about a fight with his girlfriend. But the data retrieval team found no outgoing calls, only a failed search in Google Maps at 3:16 a.m. The term. Directions to Scranton. He never admitted to packing a bag, never said he was planning to leave. But there was a moment, brief, nearly missed, when a detective asked why he hadn't searched for Brielle after returning. Owen looked down, said he didn't know, said he figured people were already looking, said he didn't want to get in the way. To some, it sounded like guilt. To others, it was fear. But either way, it was off. He wasn't arrested. There wasn't enough. No DNA, no physical evidence, no clear statement tying him to Brielle's last known movements. Just a series of contradictions and a lingering silence that settled every time his name came up. As the case went cold, Owen faded out of focus. He left Pennsylvania the following year, changed his number, deleted his social media, moved to New Hampshire, then Ohio, then disappeared from the internet entirely. Years would pass. The search would stop. But that 2-hour gap between 2:30 and 4:30 a.m. on the night a 12-year-old girl vanished never did. By 2019, the official investigation into Brielle Markson's disappearance had long since cooled. There were no more updates, no new search parties, no briefings in the firehouse or footage of dogs combing the forest. The last official press release had been over a year ago, and by then, most people assumed the case had reached its quiet end. Her face still appeared on missing posters, aging slowly through artist renderings. But the world had moved on. Everyone, it seemed, except her mother. Donna Markson never left the house for long. She worked remotely, barely spoke to neighbors, and hadn't redecorated Brielle's room. The calendar in the kitchen still showed July 2016. The light in Brielle's closet stayed on. Some days, Dana told herself her daughter might come back, older and different but alive. Other days, she believed nothing at all. Then, in early March of that year, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, postmarked from Lexington, Kentucky. No return address. No handwriting on the front, just her name, printed in block letters with a typewriter. Inside was a single piece of lined paper, yellowed slightly, as if it had sat in a drawer for a while. Written in blue ink, centered neatly in the middle of the page, were 7 words. Don't worry. She's not cold anymore. There was no signature, no date, no fingerprints. The ink wasn't smudged. It had been written carefully, almost gently. Dana stood over the kitchen sink, holding the page in both hands for nearly 10 minutes before folding it again. She didn't cry. She just stared. The letter was taken immediately to the police. Forensics tested it for latent prints, chemical traces, DNA. Nothing stood out until the handwriting was compared against known samples in their national records. A match came back within days. The letter had almost certainly been written by a man named Gerald Whitcomb, a 61-year-old former maintenance worker from Ohio, already on file for having sent false letters in several high-profile missing persons cases throughout the 2000s. He had a pattern. Brief, vague messages mailed years after the fact, intended to look like inside information. Police located Whitcomb within a week. He denied involvement at first, then admitted the letter might have been his. He claimed it was meant to comfort Dana, not torment her. He'd seen Brielle's face on a website, said he felt sorry for the mother, but when asked about the details, why that phrase, why that timing, why that state, he refused to say more. Technically, it wasn't illegal, just disgusting. For Dana, it reopened every wound that had barely scabbed over. She stopped answering her phone, asked the detective to stop calling unless they had something real. Her husband, Rick, had been trying to move forward in small ways, but now he watched his wife unravel again, as if the letter had dragged her back to day one. They told themselves it was over, that it was just a sick old man in another state. But then, 6 months later, another envelope came. This time, it was postmarked from Albany, New York. Same format, typewritten name on the front, no return address. Inside, the same phrase, same handwriting. Don't worry. She's not cold anymore. But the ink was darker, as if the pen was fresher. And there was one subtle difference. This time, there was a dot underneath the final period. Not a smudge, a deliberate centered dot. The Marksons didn't tell anyone at first. Rick said it was another copycat, someone who saw the first story in the news and wanted attention. Donna wasn't so sure. This one felt closer, cleaner, almost practiced. They turned it in anyway. Forensics ran the same battery of tests, only this time they had something. Partial DNA on the envelope flap, saliva from where it had been sealed. It didn't match Whitcomb, and it didn't match anyone in the Markson family. It wasn't in CODIS, the National Offender Database, but it was human, and it was real. A female profile, unknown. And whoever she was, she had licked the envelope just weeks earlier. Then a third letter came. Same phrase, same style. Postmarked from Binghamton, just 2 hours from Lakevale Pines. No DNA this time. But again, that same final dot beneath the period, like a tiny signature. Investigators opened a new thread in the case, this time focused not on the content, but the pattern. Someone was mailing these deliberately, not for attention, but for ritual. The stationery was cheap but consistent. The typewriter ribbon on the address lines showed identical wear marks. The letters were written on the same brand of paper, Meade College ruled, 70-sheet packs sold in most stores. The blue ink came from a Papermate pen, medium tip. But none of that led to a name. To the public, the case was still cold. But inside the department, the narrative had shifted. Someone had taken the time to write Dana Markson 3 times over the course of 12 months. The first could be dismissed. The second and third couldn't. And now, for the first time in 3 years, investigators had proof, however slight, that someone out there knew something. Not just about Brielle, but about what had happened in the hours after she vanished. Someone who might have seen her, or held her, or buried her. By the spring of 2024, Lakevale Pines had become little more than a forgotten relic, swallowed by moss and time. The camp had been shuttered for 8 years, since the day Brielle Markson vanished, but its buildings still stood in quiet disrepair, grayed by rain, windows boarded, paths overgrown. For locals, it had become a place to avoid. For developers, it was a lucrative opportunity. The land was sold quietly to a pair of real estate investors from New Jersey with plans to convert the site into a boutique eco-retreat. They envisioned rustic chic cabins, a yoga dome, and artisanal fire pits, something picturesque and detached from the digital world. The paperwork was finalized in January. By April, demolition crews had begun pulling apart the old cabins. At first, the work was uneventful. The structures came down easily, weathered wood splintering under light pressure, roofs collapsing with a shove. The team moved cabin by cabin, clearing debris, salvaging old fixtures, and preparing the main clearing for regrading. At the center of the site stood what was once the camp's gathering circle, a raised fire pit built from stacked cinder blocks, ringed with old logs that once served as benches. A larger, older pit had sat behind it, long since disused, overgrown, and filled in with soil and rock. It hadn't been part of any official blueprints. Most assumed it was from decades earlier, back when the camp first opened. It was under that forgotten ring, the one hidden behind the trees beneath a mound of leaves and ash, that the workers found something. One crew member was operating a backhoe, scraping off the topsoil when the machine's teeth caught on something dense. It clanked, popped loose, and exposed what looked like half-burnt fabric tangled in soot. They stopped the machinery and called in the site foreman. Shovels took over. At first glance, it looked like a pile of scorched rags, maybe old towels or uniforms discarded and buried years ago. But as they pulled the material free, one worker noticed something wedged in the ash, a small, twisted piece of pink plastic fused to metal. On closer inspection, it looked like a dental retainer, partially melted but still intact enough to see where the wire had once looped across the front teeth. The foreman ordered the crew to stop. Local law enforcement was called. Within hours, the area was cordoned off. Forensic techs arrived the next morning. They sifted slowly through the ash layer by layer, bagging every fragment. Mixed among the burned fabric were brittle bone shards, tiny, irregular, and darkened by fire. At first, it wasn't clear if they were human, but one technician, trained in osteology, recognized a fragment of maxilla, the upper jawbone. It was too small to be an adult. The media was kept out of the loop for the first few days. Investigators didn't want to speculate, but privately, they knew this wasn't an old trash pit. The fire had been contained deliberately. The cinder blocks had been stacked with precision. There was no evidence of food waste, no campfire debris, just ash, cloth, and bone. The retainer was sent to the lab for comparison. Brielle's dental records were still on file. She'd had orthodontic work done in early 2016, expanders, and a clear pink retainer to help correct her bite. She wore it nightly, even at camp. When the match came back positive, the site was declared a crime scene. No one said her name publicly at first, but inside the department, they all knew. 8 years after she vanished, Brielle Markson had finally been found, not in a cave, not buried in the woods, but right there in the middle of the camp, just yards away from where search teams had passed dozens of times. The realization spread slowly, numbly. She hadn't wandered off. She hadn't been taken far. She'd never left. Investigators re-examined old camp layouts, comparing fire pit records from 2016. The official logs showed nightly fires conducted in the main ring, the one closest to the cabins. But that pit, the hidden one, hadn't been documented at all. No s'more photos, no mention in camper handbooks. Most staff claimed they didn't even know it existed. But a few remembered differently. One groundskeeper, who had worked there for 5 summers, said he vaguely recalled that older pit being used once or twice when the main one flooded. He couldn't recall the exact year, just that it had been nighttime. A small group, unscheduled. The implication was chilling. Whoever had used that pit didn't do it openly. It wasn't part of the camp's routine, and it wasn't meant to be seen. The forensics team recovered more from the ash: charred cloth with stitching consistent with children's sleepwear, a partially melted sandal sole, one small button, painted lavender, engraved with the word dream. As the pieces came together, a picture began to form, not of a child lost in the woods, but of one hidden in plain sight. And still, no one could answer the only question that mattered. How did she end up there, and who had set the fire? The official confirmation came quietly, through a 2-sentence email from the county medical examiner. The bone fragments recovered from the unlogged fire pit were human, juvenile, likely female, and the dental appliance matched exactly with Brielle Markson's orthodontic records. It wasn't a possibility anymore. It wasn't a theory. It was her. The investigation, once dormant for nearly a decade, was reopened that same afternoon. Detectives began working through old notes, call logs, and interview transcripts. Evidence boxes from 2016 were pulled from basement storage and reviewed piece by piece. Nothing about the initial disappearance had pointed to fire. There had been no smoke reports, no unusual smells, no burn scars in the area. But now it was clear. A fire had happened, a fire strong enough to destroy nearly all physical evidence, and no one had noticed. Or someone had made sure no one would. The first question investigators asked was whether the pit had ever been used during the week Brielle vanished. They combed through the camp's official logs, activity schedules, counselor, duty rosters, nightly reports. According to the records, the fire pit in question, the one hidden behind the trees, hadn't been used that entire summer. Every scheduled fire was noted as taking place at the main ring in the central clearing. That pit was larger, easier to supervise, closer to staff housing. The forgotten one wasn't mentioned once, but the logs were sloppy. Several pages were missing. Others had been written retroactively, their handwriting inconsistent. One of the forms had been filled in a blue pen, despite all others being in black. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone, but it was enough to suspect someone had rewritten the week's schedule after the fact, possibly to conceal the unscheduled fire. Investigators re-interviewed several of the counselors from that summer. Most had moved on. Some barely remembered details. One said she had never even seen a second fire pit. Another admitted he remembered it being used maybe once, but couldn't say when. Everyone insisted they had no knowledge of anything unusual happening that week, and none of them recalled a fire being lit on July 28th. But there were two names on the staff list that gave investigators pause. Both counselors had left the area after the camp closed. One was deceased, Jared West, 23 at the time, who had died in a motorcycle crash in 2019. The other had no current address, no active phone, and no clear online presence. Owen Rice, the same junior counselor who had been in charge of Brielle's cabin the night she disappeared, the same one who had gone missing from 2 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. without explanation. The same one who claimed he had done a head count no one else remembered. His statements had been odd back then, hesitant, filled with maybes and probablys, but not incriminating. There hadn't been enough to hold him. But now, the circumstances felt different. The fire pit where Brielle's remains had been found was only 70 yards behind the cabin where Owen had been posted, well within walking distance, well within the time window he'd been unaccounted for. When detectives dug deeper, they found something else. Owen had legally changed his name in 2020, moved out of state, new job, new ID, no criminal record, no pending warrants. But the timing stood out. The name change came just months after the first public mention of the Brielle Markson case being reviewed by a cold case task force. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was a signal. He didn't want to be found. They flagged his new identity, subpoenaed his employment history, quietly reached out to associates to confirm his location. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued their work at the fire pit, uncovering more evidence burned so deeply into the soil that only high-resolution imaging could make sense of it. Thread patterns, melting points, carbonized fragments of children's clothing with identifiable dye signatures. One of the most disturbing finds was a EE zipper, warped and blackened but still functional, attached to what had once been the front of a sleep shirt. The tag was gone. The color was gone. But the fabric still held faint elasticity, enough to confirm it had belonged to a child roughly Brielle's size and weight. Investigators met privately with Dana and Rick Markson the following day. No press, no statements, just a quiet conversation across their kitchen table. They told them what they knew, that their daughter hadn't simply disappeared, that she had been hidden, and that the fire, the one no one logged, no one claimed, had been set intentionally. There was no longer any question of whether this had been an accident. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase her. Someone who knew where to build a fire, how to light it without attention, and how to leave no trace. And among all those who had access, who had motive, who had vanished from view, only one name kept circling back: Owen Rice. They found him working under a different name at a fabrication warehouse just outside Columbus, Ohio. Quiet job, low profile, nothing that required a background check beyond the basics. He'd been living there for nearly 4 years, renting a small basement unit in a 2-story house owned by an older couple who thought he was just polite and kept to himself. He went by Nolan Rhodes now, had a valid ID, clean license, no recent arrests. The name change paperwork was all legal, but the timing still hung over him like fog. After weeks of failed outreach through lawyers, family members, and old co-workers, the cold case unit made a formal request for a voluntary interview. To their surprise, he agreed. The room they brought him into wasn't cold or harsh, no steel tables, no two-way mirror cliches. Just a beige conference room with a carafe of coffee, 2 chairs, and a digital recorder already running. Owen, or Nolan as he now insisted, sat quietly with his hands folded on the table. He looked older. The kind of older that isn't about age, but about how someone carries years they'd rather not explain. He denied everything at first. Polite, controlled, almost mechanical. Said he remembered the night Brielle went missing, but not much else. Claimed he'd been walking the trails to manage anxiety. Said he never saw a fire pit. Said he barely remembered where it was. That part of the camp was off limits, he muttered, but the tone shifted when investigators showed him a photo, half a boot print, lifted from near the edge of the burn site, partially preserved in hardened soil and photographed before excavation began. The tread matched a discontinued model of hiking boots sold only through one retailer in 2015. Owen had worn them every day at camp that summer. A photo from the camp's own brochure that year showed him lacing them up outside Cabin B. The print had been cast and analyzed. The size, depth, and angle all pointed to him. He stared at the image for a long time. Then blinked. Then asked for water. After the pause, he began to shift. He didn't confess, not exactly. What came next wasn't a clean narrative or a clear timeline. It was fractured, halting, like someone trying to rewrite a dream they didn't want to remember. He said he had found Brielle already gone. No further detail. Just that he'd gone toward the lake early that morning and seen her lying in the grass still. He claimed he didn't know what happened. Maybe she'd wandered out and collapsed. Maybe she had a seizure. Maybe she hit her head. When pressed on why he never called for help, why he never screamed or told another counselor, he hesitated. I looked down, said he froze, said he was worried how it would look, said he panicked. He described wrapping her body in a sleeping bag, although no sleeping bag had ever been recovered, and hiding her temporarily. Said he planned to alert someone later, but didn't. Said he returned to the spot later that night and decided to make it look like she had wandered off on her own. People get lost in the woods, he said flatly. It happens. The fire? Yes, he admitted. He lit it. Said he didn't know why. Said maybe he thought it would erase things. Said he thought burning the sleeping bag would remove any confusion. He avoided eye contact. His voice never rose. There were no tears, no remorse, just soft detachment. He never explained how he moved her, never said why he chose that pit, never clarified how he got matches, or why no one saw smoke, or how he managed to leave no scent trail, no visible signs of struggle. He insisted the fire was small, controlled, that he was careful. But the burn radius investigators found extended over 4 feet, with carbon deposits and thermal distortion consistent with an intense, prolonged flame. When shown photos of the charred fabric, the melted retainer, the bone fragments, he didn't flinch. He didn't acknowledge them either. The official report would later state that Owen Rice's account lacked critical specificity, demonstrated selective recall, and showed signs of cognitive dissonance consistent with either deep denial or strategic deflection. In simpler terms, they didn't believe him. The fragments of his story didn't align with the evidence. There were no signs Brielle had wandered anywhere, no proof she'd left the cabin on her own. The idea that he just found her, already lifeless, lacked credibility. And the act of burning her body in secret at a hidden fire pit during a window of time when no one could account for his whereabouts was not the behavior of someone innocent and panicked. It was calculated. But without a full confession and without conclusive proof of murder, only destruction of remains, they couldn't charge him with homicide. Not yet. Still, what they had now was more than they'd ever had before. A man with motive, access, opportunity, and a pattern of lies stretching back 8 years. A man who had hidden behind, changed names and time. A man who, for the first time, said the fire happened. And beneath all his fragmented words, one line stood out above the rest. I didn't know what else to do. The forensic confirmation came in mid-June, weeks after the fire pit was first uncovered. DNA extracted from the charred bone fragments matched Brielle Markson's profile with a confidence level of 99.97%. The dental retainer only reinforced the result. Brielle hadn't gone missing in the wilderness. She hadn't drowned. She hadn't run away. She'd been here the entire time, her body hidden, burned, and buried within yards of where she had last been seen alive. But the final report from the medical examiner added something investigators hadn't expected: evidence of violence. The injuries to the bone fragments, specifically microfractures along the radius and ulna, weren't consistent with a fall. They were defensive, signs of struggle, the kind someone makes when trying to protect their head or face. These weren't the wounds of a child who collapsed by a lakeside. They were the last flinches of a girl who knew she was being hurt. What followed, though grim, was methodical. Forensic chemists identified traces of high-density polyethylene fused into the layers of ash and debris, likely from a common plastic trash bag. It hadn't melted in isolation, it had been burned with the body, indicating that whoever had placed Brielle in the pit had done so while she was already wrapped. The implication was clear. She had been hidden first, then set alight in a deliberate act of destruction. Investigators returned to the property in force. Now, treating the entire site as a live crime scene, they re-examined every inch of ground near the pit, focusing especially on the remains of adjacent cabins that had been partially demolished. One had sat roughly 60 feet from the fire circle, a smaller structure once used for equipment storage and counselor overflow housing. It had collapsed inward during the first wave of renovation and hadn't been flagged for special attention. Until now. The rubble was cleared away in slow, surgical layers. Beneath the cabin's rotted floorboards was a crawl space, no more than 2 feet high and ringed with cinder blocks. It wasn't visible from the outside. It wouldn't have shown up on basic scans. But the moment a technician stepped inside with a flashlight, they saw it. Melted fabric clinging to the far wall, blackened but still partially intact. Beside it, a single item that changed the tone of the investigation entirely. A small metal bracelet warped by heat but readable. The letters BM engraved on a heart-shaped charm. It was the kind of bracelet a child picks out for herself. Simple, shiny, personal. Brielle had been wearing it when she left for camp. Her mother had confirmed it in one of the first interviews, even showing a photo of Brielle wearing it in the car, smiling nervously beneath her ponytail. That bracelet had never been found, until now. The theory took shape in brutal clarity. Whoever had harmed Brielle didn't dispose of her immediately. She had been placed, or stashed, in the crawl space, wrapped in cloth or plastic, and kept there. For how long, no one could say. It could have been hours, could have been the whole night, but the fire hadn't been spontaneous, it had been premeditated. Someone had made a decision. Someone had waited for darkness, chosen the older, unused fire pit, and destroyed the evidence on their own terms. The bracelet was sent for further analysis. It carried heat damage, soot, and trace biological material. Beneath the melted cloth, more bone fragments were recovered, scorched but distinct from the initial fire site. 2 small vertebrae, one part of a scapula, all consistent with juvenile remains, all likely belonging to the same person. By now, the case narrative had transformed completely. No longer was it about a disappearance. It was a homicide investigation, with a suspected timeline, 2 potential disposal sites, and mounting physical evidence that someone at the camp had carried out an intentional act to hide what happened. When shown the photographs of the crawl space, Owen Rice, now under close monitoring, refused to comment. He declined further questioning and retained legal counsel. But the evidence was circling in on him. He had been assigned to the cabin closest to the pit. He had been unaccounted for during the critical window. He had lied about his whereabouts. And now, physical proof connected the timeline he gave to locations only someone with specific access would have known about. The crawl space was sealed after the evidence was removed. A crime scene technician wrote in her report that the air inside was still faintly sweet, like something had once decomposed there, long before the fire ever touched it. And for the first time since the case reopened, investigators had reason to believe Brielle's story didn't end where the ashes began. It had started in that dark, silent space, where no one heard her, where no one looked, where she had waited, possibly for hours, until someone made her disappear. She had been 16 at the time, one of the youngest counselors in training allowed that summer. Assigned to help supervise Cabin B, the same cabin Brielle had vanished from. Her name wasn't made public, but when the news broke in 2024 about Brielle's remains being found at the Campfire pit, she didn't sleep for 3 nights. The images played again and again in her head, but this time, they no longer felt like dreams. She reached out to authorities quietly through an email. The subject line read, "I think I saw something." The body of the message was short. She wanted to talk. She was ready now. In the interview room, she sat with her hands folded tightly. elbows locked like she was holding something in. She explained that on the night of July 28, 2016, sometime after midnight, she had woken up to the sound of someone moving inside the cabin. Not loud, just the subtle rustle of feet and fabric. When she opened her eyes, she saw Owen Rice standing beside one of the bunks, leaning forward. She couldn't see clearly at first, just the outline of him, but the more she watched, the more it took shape. He wasn't standing. He was kneeling beside Brielle's bed. She whispered his name, confused. He turned slowly, looking startled, and walked over. She remembered what he said. She had a nosebleed. I was checking on her. He sounded calm. She remembered thinking how normal his voice had sounded, how she hadn't seen blood. He told her everything was okay, said she should go back to sleep. And she did. Because at 16, you assume adults are telling the truth. Because nothing in her head could make sense of what might have actually been happening in front of her. She never told anyone, not her parents, not the other counselors, not the police when they questioned everyone. She said she felt stupid. Like maybe it wasn't what she thought. Like maybe if she said it out loud, she'd make it worse. But now, 8 years later, with the evidence dug out of the earth and the photos printed in the news, she was sure. She hadn't imagined it. And the man beside the bed that night wasn't checking on a nosebleed. He was doing something else entirely. Her testimony gave investigators the break they needed. With fresh witness input, they filed for a rearrest. Owen Rice was taken into custody without incident. He didn't speak. Not when they read him his rights, not in the car, not once seated in the holding cell. This time, detectives had more than suspicion. They had a living witness, a physical location, 2 confirmed sites of concealment, and now, digital evidence that had once been discarded as irrelevant. Back in 2016, investigators had reviewed Owen's phone, at least what little could be accessed, but most of the data had been wiped. There was no cloud sync and no backups and limited forensic capability at the time. It had never yielded anything useful. But in 2024, with advanced data retrieval tools and access to decommissioned carrier logs, investigators managed to retrieve fragments from the night of Brielle's disappearance, fragments stored in backup servers long forgotten by the original case team. What they found changed everything. Between 3:08 and 4:02 a.m. that night, Owen's phone was active, but not in use. It had pinged repeatedly from a location just behind cabin B, roughly aligning with the old, disused fire pit. The movements were small, localized, like someone walking in tight circles or staying near one spot. And at 3:49 a.m., a search string was logged, partially corrupted but still visible. Burn time for clothes and hair. That search was never in the original evidence report. It had been deleted before the phone was ever turned over to police, and now, nearly a decade later, it stood as a digital confession, not direct, not definitive, but damning. When shown the search log in questioning, Owen said nothing. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the wall. When asked if he remembered typing it, he shook his head. When asked why the location data placed him at the pit during that exact time window, he said nothing at all. It wasn't enough for a conviction, not yet, but it was enough for charges, tampering with evidence, destruction of human remains, obstruction. And with each new detail, the case that had once gone still and cold began to move again. The girl who had stayed silent for 8 years finally spoke, and the words she had kept buried became the weight that cracked the wall open. The final excavation of the pit was different from the first. This time, it wasn't about searching. It was about knowing. Forensics had confirmed the remains. The crawl space had revealed the bracelet. The recovered phone data had placed Owen at the site. But there was still more to pull from the ash, not for charges, but for truth. The kind of truth that leaves no room for denial. Over several days, specialists in fire pattern analysis, taphonomy, and trace evidence worked in tight shifts. They used soft brushes and dental tools, extracting layers of compacted ash that had settled in concentric patterns. At a depth of just under 12 inches, they found it. Fragments of zippers, metallic fasteners warped by heat, Pieces of synthetic thread fused to the soil. Then came something unmistakably human. Cartilage, partial and charred, but intact enough to be identified. Most likely nasal or ear tissue, never completely consumed by the fire. Then, a small item tucked beneath a collapsed section of brick. A plastic inhaler, half melted, its cap missing. On the side, barely legible, the name Brielle, written in purple permanent marker. Faded, warped by flame. But there. Her mother later confirmed it had been in her bag when she left for camp. Brielle had suffered from mild asthma, the kind triggered by stress, heat, or fear. That inhaler had sat in that pit for 8 years, through rain, through winter, through demolition, undisturbed, untouched, waiting. With the physical evidence now overwhelming, investigators reconstructed the night of July 28, 2016, with quiet precision. Not speculation, not theory, but steps, times, paths. The last hours of a 12-year-old girl who had simply gone to sleep in her bunk and never woken up. Owen had developed what psychologists would later describe as a boundary-eroding fixation. It was subtle, built on observation, not contact. He saw Brielle as quiet, withdrawn, the type who didn't fight back. There were no signs he had ever acted before that night. But at some point in the dark, something shifted. Whether he approached her bunk under the guise of checking on her or for something else, no one could say for sure. But when Brielle resisted, maybe she screamed, maybe she kicked, he panicked. The bunk beds were light, the walls thin, the girls asleep. He used a pillow, held it down too long, realized too late what he'd done. The evidence suggested suffocation, no trauma to the skull, no lacerations, just a stillness that had become permanent. After that, everything became a strategy. He wrapped her in something, likely a sleeping bag or plastic sheet, carried her across the back path to the old cabin, slid her into the crawl space. It would explain why dogs hadn't picked up a trail, why the scent had vanished at the cabin steps, why no one ever saw a thing. He returned to his own cabin afterward, waited, showed up later, drenched in sweat, said he'd gone running, said nothing else. But days later, after the search parties had started thinning out, he made the second decision, a darker one. He waited for the grounds to empty, maybe past curfew. He carried her from the crawl space to the unregistered fire pit, far enough to be out of sight, close enough to do alone. He built a fire strong enough to conceal. He added accelerants, likely from a maintenance shed, and he burned what he could. There were no cameras at the camp. No one logged the fire. The pit hadn't been listed on any activity sheet. Owen had worked quickly, quietly, and until 2024, no one had known it was there. It worked, for 8 years. In the final stages of the trial, his defense tried to claim panic, that he hadn't meant for her to die, that he had made poor decisions in fear. But the jury didn't see fear. They saw preparation. They saw a method. They saw the silence he had kept for nearly a decade. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brielle's parents were there for the verdict. Dana held the inhaler in her coat pocket as the sentence was read. Rick sat silent, one hand around hers. They didn't speak to reporters. They didn't give statements. But they stayed until the end. Lakevale Pines was sold to the state and condemned within the year. No one wanted the land. No one wanted the buildings. They were flattened in slow rotations, rubble hauled off in covered trucks. The trees were left alone, but the cabin foundations were filled in, the signs removed, the trails erased. Where the pit once sat, a plaque was placed into the soil. It was small, bronze. It didn't list dates. It didn't mention how she died. It simply read, Brielle Markson. She was never missing. She was hidden, and the truth, once buried, was no longer silent.